Welcome into the Footballguys DFS Show. It's week 9, and we are going to dive through the slate. We have a bigger slate again this week, like we did last week. We have two teams on buys, with the Steelers and the 49ers on buy. So no weird games, no London games, anything like that. So we're going to have a nice big slate this week. And I know that last week there was a little bit of frustration on the big slate that we saw, and we were talking about it a little bit pre-show. And Phil, you were talking about diving in maybe on some of these big slates and the frustration that you could feel on those. But myself, Jeff Bell, with Phil Alexander, and our DFS captain, Devin Knotts, here tonight. But Phil, you want to go off on that a little bit?
Yeah, I had by far my worst week of the season, and I was reminded very quickly that it's usually on these large slates that I don't do so well. And I think it has to do, everything in DFS kind of relates to each other and kind of flows into harmony. Game selection, the size of the slate, bankroll management, it all matters. And all of those factors were at play for me last week. But I think for myself, I've settled in more as probably like 80% of my entries in any given week are single or low entry tournaments, without huge fields. And I've done that because you don't have to be perfect to make deep runs in those types of fields. As an example, the $75 goal line on DraftKings is a $75 entry, 3 max, 4,000 to first place. So you still get paid off if you do well, but you only have, like I said, 600 or 700 people to beat, and you usually don't need a perfect score. But on weeks like this week and weeks like last week, where playing those kind of tournaments runs into trouble is if you make some micro lineup decisions that turn out to be incorrect, on a slate where there's so many choices to make, it's really going to hurt you. So, like for last week, the one that I struck out on was not playing Cedric Tillman and playing Trey Palmer instead, as that medium range, low owned punt play that ended up going off. And it wasn't Palmer, and that kind of ruined my week in a lot of those lineups where I was otherwise kind of nailing the plays, or that and the chalk hit. And
so what you're saying is just pick better players, like that's the key.
Yeah, I guess so. But I guess the point that I'm making is, like, you're going to get beat by really good players who are really good at stacking a lot of these macro decisions together. And on a big slate, there's more of them to make. And you really need to make sure that you're getting the right ones right. Is that a long way of saying pick better players? Maybe. But I failed to do it last week, and I'm aggravated, and I felt like I needed to vent about it just a touch.
So we're just talking politics today, since you're frustrated at DFS. Like, that's what this show is going to be. Okay.
Make my bankroll great again.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I don't know about the YouTube algorithm kicking us out on mentioning the P word, but no, we're gonna
it's either gonna help or hurt, one or the other. Who knows?
And Devin, you were on the right punt play, because your discount play of the week was Cedric Tillman, who went off for 2 touchdowns, delivered a victory for your Browns, and so that's good. But I know this week we are going to get Cracking FanDuel back on track, and to step into that, let's talk about games of the week. And Devin, where are you looking this week for games of the week?
That's Phil's topic.
Okay, Phil. I was switching up tonight. Phil, what's your games of the week?
All right, so big slate, bunch of games that look really good on paper. I'll rattle off a couple, and I'll give you guys a shot to chime in again. I think the premier game on the slate is probably Cowboys at Falcons. Falcons are a 2.5 point favorite. Highest over under on the slate at 51.5 points. So that's projected to be close and high scoring, which is just how we like it. Interestingly, I don't know that I've seen a ton of ownership settling on that game. So that is the reason that I brought it up first as one that I really like. But after that, there's a lot of other good ones. Dolphins at Bills, now that Tua is back. We saw that offense instantly get on track against Arizona. I think that one has a shot to shoot out. Bills are big favorites there, -6.5, but the over-under is 49.5. And then a really interesting one, and this is the last one I'll mention for now, unless you guys don't get to some of the other ones that I have written down. Packers are hosting the Lions. Lions are 3.5-point favorites. The over-under is 48.5. And what I think is really interesting about that one is we have Jordan Love with a groin injury. And not only did the line not move off of that injury, but the over-under actually went up a point from the opening line. Or at least that's how it was last night when I first looked these up and started putting it together. So I don't know if that's an indication that Love is going to be fine and Vegas is expecting him to play, or maybe they're just expecting it to be high scoring, even if Malik Willis is the quarterback, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I agree on that being a little bit crazy given the strength that we've seen from this Lions defense being against the run game. And you would think that they would have to rely on the run game a little bit more. But with the Packers having a bye next week, and there was positive news about Love, that maybe the injury wasn't quite nearly as bad as they thought at first. But Devin, do you have any other games that you're taking a look at?
I think you mentioned Dolphins, Bills. Raiders, Bengals is the only other one that I think could be a potential shootout. The Bengals defense is just atrocious. And we get the Gardner Minshew experience again this week. So I'm sure we'll talk about that at the quarterback position.
Yeah.
Did you touch Rams, Seahawks, I assume? Okay. And then the Eagles side against the Jaguars too. So.
Yeah, Rams Seahawks was the one that we hadn't really talked about. And then, like you guys said, it's all sides. We've got a lot of big favorites on this slate. Ravens -9 projected to score 27.25. Bengals are 7.5-point favorites against the Raiders, 26.75, and then the Eagles 7.5. So certainly, even though those might not be shootout game environments, we could see the favorites go up big, and then the underdogs coming back in garbage time, or the underdogs making a game out of it, and turning some of those into shootouts. So those are definitely also sides to watch.
Speaking of politics, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. Maybe we're thinking about underdogs here this week, boys.
Live dogs this week. All right. Before we move on, please take a minute to like and subscribe to the channel. We are going to give you all the content we possibly can. But Devin, what is your cash game quarterback lineup this week?
Just gonna see how many political references I can get just to make Jeff uncomfortable. Gardner Minshew, I talked about him, 4,500. I think you could certainly start there. There's no one who epitomizes America more than Gardner Minshew. And
hold on. There's no one that epitomizes Florida more than Gardner Minshew. Corrected. Yeah. Go on.
We don't know if he's going to come out in a Top Gun outfit. I'm excited to see his Halloween outfit. It's just going to be fantastic. Has nothing to do with how he's going to play. But, in these spots where he's been the starter, he can certainly perform. And going up against, in his last 3 games, he's had very difficult matchups against the Broncos and Chiefs. The Rams are certainly not a great matchup, or certainly not a great defense there. But I think he's in a really good spot this week at 4,500, going up against the Bengals, who are allowing the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this season. Jalen Hurts put up a huge game. A lot of their damage has been to running quarterbacks, so that's the one concern there. But we saw Lamar throw for 348 and 4 touchdowns. So at 4,500, if you're looking to go to the bottom, I think it's a really solid price, and we'll talk about running back. Again, there's almost no value there. If you want to spend up, I think Geno Smith is the guy at 5,800. I'm not going any higher than that. The 7,500 of Jaden Daniels and 8,000 for Lamar Jackson is just too high this week. Smith, he's been consistent. I don't think he has the upside that you're going to want to target. But if you're looking for 230, 240 yards, upside of a couple touchdowns, he's certainly that guy. But I'm paying down for Gardner Minshew this week on the road against the Bengals, who quietly have been like one of the most disappointing teams all season.
You
So
sure you want
Jeff,
the Geno Smith side of that game instead of the Matthew Stafford side of that game after we saw the return of Puka Nacua and the return of Cooper Kupp, and Stafford looking pretty strong on that Thursday night, having a little bit of a long week to rest?
Certainly a fair point. Going on the road to Seattle, I think is not ideal, but I completely understand the Stafford call there.
I'm wondering about Geno Smith a little bit. Something last week, because I recommended him as a cash game play last week, turned out to be a bad call. Jeff had asked me last week, does it matter if DK Metcalf plays? And I said, nah, it doesn't matter. They have good receivers and they're still going to throw a lot. And I guess maybe Geno is used to safeties giving him some more room to operate when Metcalf's on the field or something, because last week was his worst game of the season. So I'm a little bit leery of Geno if Metcalf doesn't play. I think he will, or I think the coaches are expecting him to, even though as of today, which is Wednesday, he did not practice. I agree with Devin that we're paying down at quarterback. I think where I'm going to land is also in agreement with Devin that Minshew is going to be the best play, because it does allow you to spend a couple $100 extra at running back, which I think is advantageous this week. Our top point per dollar quarterback currently, or as of this afternoon, was Daniel Jones. Um, I, yeah, I see you shaking your head, and I kind of felt the same way. I felt the same way about Bo Nix last week, in fairness, and that didn't work out so well for cash games. But he is our top point per dollar play. It's very shaky. He's been so horrendous the last 3 weeks. The Commanders have improved a lot since he last scored 18 points against them in week 2. Against the pass, we just saw them give Caleb Williams a really hard time.
They're selling out
down,
to stop the pass. Like they're really trying. I mean, they're only allowing 202 passing yards per game. I think the models for like projections just continue to have that baked in, that their pass defense is worse than what it truly is. So, they got burned the first 3 weeks of the season. But since then, less than 10 points to Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, Andy Dalton, Caleb Williams. So I can't get behind that.
Me either. And the early run of my numbers has him about 3 times more likely to be optimal than Gardner Minshew. So it's early in the week for this stuff, but I'm going with my gut again, and that says that Minshew is the better call. And in fact, if I was going to spend in the Daniel Jones range, what do you think of Justin Herbert at 5,300? Where over the last 3 weeks we've seen a shift towards the pass for the Chargers, 34, 39, and 32 pass attempts in the previous 3 games, where they had been between 18 and 27 pass attempts prior to that in every game. And all of these games were competitive. None were the result of throwing in garbage time. Herbert has 14, 18, 24 DraftKings points in those 3 games. Matchup in Cleveland is good, not great. And if you were asking me who I trust to score 15 to 17 DraftKings points between Jones and Herbert, I'm definitely saying Herbert. But I think that Minshew is also in that range this week, and he cost $800 less. So why belabor the point? Let's just go with Minshew.
I had Herbert on my sheet too, and I was going to mention him if you did not. That's really interesting, because it really is kind of two conflicting narratives from early season, mentioning Daniel Jones going up against Washington and the view that Washington is a defensive target. And Devin hit the point on the head. They got shredded by Baker Mayfield week 1. They got beat up by Joe Burrow week 3. Other than that, they've been excellent. One of the very best defenses against the pass. And then Herbert, that was kind of set in stone, that's that run first offense. That's all they do. The efficiency has fallen out of the bottom of the run game. Defenses are selling out to stop it. And turns out Justin Herbert's still a pretty good quarterback, and they're willing to allow him to be that good quarterback. So I do love all of those calls, and I love the Minshew call as well as a centerpiece there at 4,500. That's difficult to ignore. Let's move into the running backs now. And Phil, where are you going to go with your running backs?
Well, first of all, I think we have to pour one out for what should have been Tyrone Tracy chalk week at 5,500. Although I just did read a tweet that he was on the practice field today doing some light work with and without a helmet, and that he could progress to a practice tomorrow. If that's the case, I mean, it seemed very unlikely considering they played Monday night and he has a brain injury. But if he were to somehow miraculously clear the protocol between now and then, I think you have to lock Tracy into one of those spots. But as it stands today, I would say let's assume that Tracy's going to miss. I think DeAndre Swift is the first running back that I'm looking at 6,300. I would like to pat myself on the back because he was one of my best calls during the preseason, and I was kind of on an island out there. DeAndre Swift does not have many fans in the fantasy community, I learned. And I took a lot of flack for touting him as a low-end running back 1 or a high-end running back 2 for this year, and that's exactly what he is. He's now reeled off at least 20 DraftKings points in 4 straight. The opponent this week is Arizona. We just saw them get torched by the Miami running backs in both the running game and the passing game, and they allow about 20% more fantasy points to opposing running backs than league average this year. I think Swift is a great play at 6,300. I'm still juggling RB2 a little bit. I really want to pay up to Bijan Robinson. I think he is in a good spot this week at 7,400, but I could not fit him go up further, Devin's saying. Interesting.
Kyren Williams, 8,000.
Yeah, that Seattle run defense has been.
They're allowing the most rushing
yards
in the NFL this season. Kyren Williams has scored a touchdown in every game this year. I think 10 or 11 straight.
Okay,
I'm paying the price because I'm going down with Minshew and then going down with the Browns receiver that we'll talk about in a second, and you can get it done.
Okay.
I land right in the middle with Alvin Kamara at 7,800, going up against the Panthers there. I mean,
that one's tricky. Like, would I rather spend 200 more for Kyren or Alvin Kamara? I don't know. I feel a little bit safer with Kyren. Maybe it's just history. I don't know. I think I like Kamara as a GPP play, but
that offense in New Orleans is kind of fragile, and Kamara's been banged up, and he's older, and we're approaching the midway point in the season. I understand the hesitation a little bit, although he projects very well. So I would not fault anyone for flipping over a cash game lineup with Kamara in it. So Kyren Williams is interesting. I couldn't get up to that tier of Bijan Robinson 7,400, Kyren Williams 8,000, Saquon Barkley 8,200. I think is also in play. I landed on HN, which was another I know better play because he does not project very well at the current time. But in 3-2 Tagovailoa starts this season, he's got 23, 29.5, 26.7 DraftKings points. One of those games came against Buffalo in week 2 earlier this season. He's got at least 7 or 8 targets in all of those 3 games. So he could get there without a touchdown, which I think is important on DraftKings. He's still underpriced. I would say that at this point with Tua in the lineup, he's kind of proven to have an identical role to Bijan Robinson, but he's 700 less than Bijan Robinson. So I think that there's a good value there with HN. I don't know. I'm still a little bit up in the air. These big slates do get me. But
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just a little confused as far as how you can't get up to a Kyren Williams, and maybe we'll get there in a little bit. But I mean, to me, it's if you take 4,500 at your quarterback and you have a $4,300 receiver or even a $3,800 receiver that's playable this week, it seems pretty easy to me. But what do I know? Tony Pollard's the only other name that I would mention. Going up against New England, another defense that's on quit watch, allowing one of the highest, fourth most fantasy points to or fourth most rushing yards to opposing receivers, third most fantasy points to opposing running backs. I can't talk. My brain is officially a mush at week 9. But they've allowed 80 yards or more to 7 running backs in the last 6 games. So I think for Pollard, it's certainly an option if you wanted to go down there.
Would Tajay Spears returning to the lineup this week put you off of Pollard? No. Okay.
No, that had shifted. That was no longer a committee. That was all Pollard's backfield, even before that injury. They love Pollard there, that coaching staff. I'm a little bit hesitant on that because it seems the team that plays the Lions the next week has nothing left in the tank, and the Titans got annihilated by the Lions a week ago. So that one is in the back of my mind. Chase Brown at 5,900 going up against the Raiders. The Bengals are favored, and Chase Brown seems to have taken over the rushing share, whereas Zach Moss kind of still gets to pass block. That's one I think that maybe the lowest that I can possibly go on the board at 5,900 right now is Chase Brown.
Chase Brown or Nick Chubb?
They're right there. I'd still go Chase Brown, I think. I'd like to see maybe a Chubb ceiling game. I feel like we're kind of sitting at a touchdown and 50-ish yards. Feels like a ceiling right now.
We'll talk about GPPs, but I think he's more of a GPP play this week. I think now that teams have seen, we'll get there.
What about Alexander Madison at 5,700?
Hard pass.
Hard pass on Madison.
I mean, how many times have we done?
That was the cheapest guy I would consider. I mean, it's not for the faint of heart at all.
Yeah, but if you're there on Gardner Minshew and you're going to play, you can't play Alexander Madison too in your cash. So
Alexander Madison, you're right, would only be in my lineup if I landed on another quarterback. But he had 90% of the Raiders' expected backfield points last week. It resulted in 9.4 DraftKings points, but the matchup was the absolute worst. And before that, he was at 15 and 17 DraftKings points in the previous 2 games with more neutral matchups, which the Bengals certainly are. So I don't think there's a reason to, like Devin said, but I wouldn't.
Not a guy I ever target.
All right,
if
Devin,
you had to
targets, what's your wide receiver plays for this week? How are you building out those wide receiver cash game lineups?
I mean, I think you have to start at Cedric Tillman at 4,300. I mean, you could look at Elijah Moore at 3,800. I think he's 4,200 for Moore. Completely fine if you wanted to look that way too. I just think Tillman, again, the Browns are sort of in this talent evaluation mode where they need to figure out what they have and what they don't, because they've traded away Amari Cooper. Tillman is in his second year. He's a big receiver, 6'3", has the makings of potentially emerging as that top guy that they could build around. And, he produced last week. So certainly the price hasn't adjusted nearly as much as a guy who has 12 targets and 9 targets in his last 2 games, all things considered. So he's the first guy that I'm looking at this week. After that, it gets hard because you get into these like weird ranges where you could spend up or you could spend down, and it's, you could certainly pair Jacoby Myers with Gardner Minshew. 5,300 is not a terrible price. We've seen Myers, 10 or more DraftKings points in 3 of his last 4 games, 14.2 last week after coming back from injury in a difficult matchup against Kansas City. Better matchup this week against Cincinnati, so I think it's certainly in play. And then who are we spending up on, I think, is the big question of the week. Are we looking at where I'm probably going is I think Tyreek Hill at 7,300 is still undervalued. I understand like he didn't really hit last week. nearly as much as what people wanted him to. But he still had 6 for 72. And if you told me in week 9 that I get Tyreek Hill at $7,300 against Buffalo, I'm taking that all day. So I'm going back to that well. I know it's risky, but this is a guy who had almost 2,000 yards last year, and you're still getting him in at a discount. I mean, he's less than Malik Neighbors. He's the same price as Puka Nacua, who I think Nacua is a great play as well. But I'm already playing Kyron Williams, and I don't really want to double invest in the Rams only to watch Cooper Kupp score 2 touchdowns. So that's sort of how I'm playing it. I'm going Myers, Tillman, and Hill, I think, as of Wednesday night.
What are you looking at, Phil?
Okay, so now it has crystallized where Devin and I differ and where the money is getting spent. I think that the choice between Tyreek Hill and Malik Neighbors is a really, really hard one. Um, I totally agree with Devin on Hill. Neighbors has obviously slowed down since he's come back from the concussion, but the volume remains. I think he's having to adjust to defenses, paying him a little bit more attention, and Daniel Jones maybe sucking a little bit more than he did earlier this season. But earlier this season, it's not like Jones was good. I mean, we saw him with games where he had 10 DraftKings points and Neighbors had 26. And
Can I make the case against Neighbors?
Sure.
13.2 yards per target, 12.7 since then in his first 2 games. Since then, 9.8, 9.6, 10.3, 10.1. They're using him as like a tight end.
Yep, they're definitely getting it out much quicker and not running them downfield. So that might be the deciding factor. I don't disagree with Tyreek Hill, but I think the bigger takeaway is I do agree with the price range. I also agree with the price range on Jacoby Myers, and I think if you're playing Gardner Minshew, that does make sense to add a little bit of juice, a little bit of upside to go along with the floor. I had 2 versions of the lineup, one with Minshew and Myers, and then the other with Justin Herbert and Lad McConkey. So I think that either or makes some sense. McConkey might be a little bit of an overreaction to the great game that he had against the poor defense last week, or it might be that he's a really talented rookie, and those guys usually play better once they've got a few games under their belt. And we could be seeing the beginning of a true second half breakout for McConkey. If you're going to bet on the latter, I wouldn't argue. And I don't think if we're wrong on that bet, it's necessarily going to ruin our lineups because he's got 8 DraftKings points in each of his last 4, and that includes the big 32-point slate breaker last week. So he's not going to kill you, whereas Myers has the same floor but doesn't have nearly the same ceiling. So something I'm still weighing out. I think that the point per dollar value on those 2 stacks is close. Raiders are a little bit cheaper, might help you step up to one of the higher price running backs where, like I said, the Chargers might give you a little bit more ceiling, but a little bit more variance. So it's close there. And then Devin mentioned Puka Nacua, and that's the reason why I'm not getting to one of these really high price running backs. I want to play him in cash. He was in my GPP section, and I moved him up because I just couldn't stop clicking on the name. It might be the whole thing that my friend Matt Kelly from Player Profiler, he calls it vividness bias, meaning we just watched it on Thursday night, right, play out for an entire half, and we were eager to see how Nacua was going to look, and all we remember is the Rams just force-feeding him. Like they're giving it to him on run plays, they're passing it to him, he's getting downfield, he's running crossers, and like he was just awesome in prime vision on Thursday. So the risk, and he does carry risk, is that it ends up a Cooper Kupp week. But I think it seemed pretty evident at this point that Matthew Stafford knows how he wants to get that ball downfield. And it's by peppering Nacua. I love the game environment. He's at least a little bit underpriced based on his projection. As an example, I have him projected for more points than Kupp and more points than A.J. Brown, and those guys are more money than Nacua is. So I think you can make the case for Nacua, but it's going to come at the expense of a Kyron Williams or a Bijan Robinson if you're playing all the other guys that we talked about.
Yeah, those guys, the running backs just feel safer to me. I get the call, but it just feels
It's
a little
fair.
safer.
Chris Olave at 6,100 going up against Carolina, coming off a 8 for 107 week. I just want to play somebody against Carolina every single week, if possible, until they prove me wrong. Because right now, it's like a guaranteed 35 points for the team. It seems like. I mean, you got Denver. Maybe they didn't get there last week because throwing those trick plays, but we did see Bo Nix certainly have a great game against them. I'm
It's
sitting
a
here.
rule that Jeff has to mention an Ohio State receiver every single week.
Yes, that is a rule too. But the ones that are off 107 going up against Carolina are particularly at 6,100 must be mentioned. My other rule, must mention Buffalo Bill. I've got two that are kind of sitting there: the Khalil Shakir at 5,900 and Keon Coleman at 5,400. The Bills, they traded for that number one receiver, but it might have been Keon Coleman that they actually became the number one receiver when they made that deal for Amari Cooper. You could have some concerns about maybe Cooper gets a bigger role finally this week and kind of splits that out a little bit. But Josh Allen has absolutely owned the Miami Dolphins in his career. That's been green light plus whenever he's playing the Dolphins. And so I want a piece of that. And if I'm looking at the best way to get that piece of that, it's either, to me, Shakir at 59 or Keon Coleman at 54. And then Drake London's kind of sitting there at 6,700 in that game that we mentioned with that big over under. And I know last week everybody was hoping to seeing Drake London go off against the Buccaneers the way that he did the last time he played them. The volume's been there every single week except for last week. The touchdowns have been there every week except for last week. That seems like one that maybe is a little bit underpriced. But we can go to tight ends now. And Phil, what are you looking at for tight ends?
Yeah, so I think it is probably a week to pay up at tight end, at least a bit. It's going to depend on how some injury situations play out for me. I'm looking at the Jacksonville offense, and if they happen to be without, we know they're going to be without Christian Kirk. They might be without Brian Thomas. I did not see Gabe Davis's availability for practice today, but I know that he was hurt last week. The last man standing in the passing offense might be Evan Ingram at 5,300. And if that's the case, or even if two out of those three guys is back, I think he's the one I'm clicking on. But otherwise, I think Trey McBride is probably my favorite play in terms of a high floor. He just doesn't really fail to get to double digits on DraftKings, and it's bankable. I think those are really the only two that I had.
Kyle Pitts, 4,900.
Cash, huh?
10 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, 23.1 last week. Has at least 65 yards in each of his last 4. Is really becoming more of it, having more of a role in this offense as the number 2 receiver behind Drake London. The Dallas matchup doesn't really worry me too much. I think their corners are better than stopping against tight ends. So I think that Pitts is certainly a guy. Dallas allowed 128 yards and a touchdown to George Kittle last week. They've allowed 10 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games to the position, and that includes Connor Hayward and Pat Freiermuth, who both did it as well. So I think that this is a Kyle Pitts week for me. I mean, I'd love to pay up, but I can't get to David Njoku or Brock Bowers.
Tight end's fun again. We got fun tight ends, and you mentioned Brock Bowers. The Bengals have been horrible against the tight end position over the last month. The last 4, they've allowed 22 points per game, and so they've just been shredded by the tight ends. And if you are playing Minshew and you wanted to go a stack there and you could get up there, that's an interesting play. Sam Laporta might be back. We saw it last week, and maybe it was the Titans, but the Titans have been good against the tight end position, and Laporta kind of went off a little bit last week. And then Mark Andrews sitting down here at 4,200, and I know that there's maybe some concern about Deontay Johnson and how that splits out there, but Mark Andrews has been rolling for the last month, and if I can get that at 4,200, that's appetizing to me too. But before we move on, make sure to head to footballguys.com/plans to become a Hall of Fame subscriber. Hall of Fame subscribers can get access to all DFS content for less than $20 monthly or $95 annually. Now let's open up the board and let's hit our GPP plays. And Devin, what are you going to do with the GPP quarterback position?
It's a fun one this week because there are so many different ways that you could go. And I think a lot of it's going to be stack related. So one guy that I'm really looking at this week is Joe Burrow going up against on the other side of this Las Vegas game. I think that he's in a position to have a potential breakout game. You know, they're 3-5, sort of can't lose type game for Cincinnati. And, you know, Burrow has faced, I don't know, he hasn't been great the last 3 weeks, but we've seen upside from him. We saw the huge game against Baltimore. He had the big game against Washington earlier this year. I think the talent in Cincinnati can overwhelm the Raiders side of this game. I think an interesting one this week who is going pretty under the radar, down at 1% rostered, is Caleb Williams against Arizona. So a lot of people are going to be on this DeAndre Swift side. I think Caleb Williams, you know, he has, since they came back from London, he hasn't looked as great as he did early on, but I think he's certainly a guy that had shown signs prior to last week that he's a guy who could step up in this offense. And at 1% rostered, this game certainly could be a shootout potential. Even though the Bears defense is pretty good. And then the last name I'll throw out there, I mean, just Jameis Winston. I think at 5,400, we saw what Joe Flacco did last year, where it was just like he's going to get close to 300 yards almost every week. The optimizers, the props, everything was too low for Flacco, and he just crushed it every single week. So there's not real data behind Winston, right? They don't really have great wide receivers. They don't really have great offensive projections, but I think he's certainly interesting.
Phil, what are you going to look at?
Yeah, I agree with Jameis Winston. From this point forward, as long as he's the starting quarterback, play a Cleveland stack every week, especially this week while all of the pieces in the passing game remain inexpensive, relatively outside of David Njoku. Point per dollar wise, that's going to help. And I don't think anybody wants to play Winston in what looks like a pace down game against the Chargers, but we talked about it a little bit, right? If that could be a good spot for Herbert, then it could also be an equally good spot for Winston. The two names that I had on my list, and I'll up it to 3 while I'm sitting here. The first one is I think you could just take your cash game lineup and take Minshew and Myers out of it and put Mason Rudolph and Calvin Ridley into it. And in doing so, you're locking in 2 players that aren't going to be highly owned that I think proved last week that they have a higher ceiling than that Minshew-Myers pairing. And I don't know, it looked like New England's defense was maybe a little bit more inspired last week, but we've also got, half a season of evidence now that it is less than inspiring. So I think you could play Rudolph and Ridley. I like Kyler Murray in what looks like a bad matchup against Chicago. He's playing well over the last 2 weeks and wins over the Chargers and Dolphins, at least 20 DraftKings points in 3 out of his last 4. Chicago has faced kind of a light quarterback schedule, and Murray's escapability is just a wild card that you want to have in your hand and be able to play in GPPs. He could have a huge game in any matchup. And then Lamar Jackson at 8,000. He is currently projecting for low ownership. I think that people fear the Denver defense, or they don't think that the Denver offense is going to be able to push Baltimore. But I don't know about that. And I don't know that it matters for Lamar Jackson in the year 2024. He's got 6 out of 8 games with at least 24 DraftKings points. That's a 3x on his high salary. And in 2 of his last 4, he's shown the ceiling. He's gone over 35 points. I think he's just better than a good defense. So I guess the kids call that matchup proof. So just play Lamar Jackson, especially if he's not going to get piled on by the crowd. He's a 9.5 point favorite at home. I mean, we like our QBs in these spots, especially if it's someone with the profile of Lamar Jackson.
So last week we got the bounce back game, maybe, or at least he got pushed into the end zone 2 times for Jalen Hurts. We saw the great fantasy production for that one, going up against a Jacksonville team that you talk about quit watch. Half the Jacksonville team's already been traded, so I don't know what's left to quit. And then again, Josh Allen, talk about him going up against Miami. That's always been a smash spot at 7,700. We talked about the biggest game of the week potentially being that Dallas and Atlanta game, and you could maybe make the argument both quarterbacks are plays on that one, but I do like the Cousins side more of that because we've kind of seen a little bit more consistency and higher upside over the past year for Cousins.
Help me understand. Go ahead.
I was going to no, I'm talking.
Help me understand why we don't like Bo Nix this week, or why people don't like Bo Nix this week. Is it a price thing?
Numbers suggest we should, because
everyone loved him last week
has been horrible.
Everyone loved him against Carolina. He hit. Now he's facing possibly an even worse defense against the pass in Baltimore. Jameis Winston just threw for 330. They're going to have to throw the entire game. He's going to be 2% rostered.
He will 100% be in my player pool and probably a decent part of it. Maybe like 10% of my lineups or something like that will have Bo Nix. The trick is stacking him in tournaments.
Yeah, that's the problem, right?
The other defense, the Ravens defense.
Yeah, it's like you pick a receiver and then Cortland Sutton completely duds out and has 0. You think it's going to be Devon Vele. Whoops, little Jordan Humphrey is in the starting lineup now. There's just no rhyme or reason to it, and that does make it hard in the tournament setting.
Yeah.
If Malik Willis is getting the start at 5,500 against the Lions in a game that could shoot out, I mean, he went over 200 yards passing and 70-plus rushing yards the last time he played. Granted, that was Tennessee, and the Lions have been a meat grinder. It could be there in a dual threat skill set. I think he's looked more competent than what anybody's expected this year. So just saying. Let's look at running backs now. Phil, what are you looking at for running backs on your GPP plays?
Yeah, so this one is contingent on Tracy missing the game for the Giants, but I don't think people are going to want to play Devin Singletary, even if Tracy is inactive, which I think might be a mistake because the path of least resistance against that Washington defense, like we've been talking about, it's no longer the pass. It's definitely the run. With Swift out there for $200 more than Singletary, I think people are going to just kind of look past him, even though it really is a good spot for the Giants running game. I just don't see Singletary coming off the field that much with Tracy out. And if people do like Neighbors as much as I do, and that does lift Jones, to a guy that people play on the cheap, I think that Singletary might provide a little bit of leverage on that pairing. You mentioned Chase Brown earlier, Jeff, and I have him here in my GPP column. I think people are kind of adverse to playing running backs in a timeshare, but like you pointed out, the Bengals want him in when they're running the ball, and now they're favored by more than a touchdown at home. They're going to be running the ball, and he's got the explosiveness and the goal line role that we like in GPPs. This really could be like a true breakout week for Chase Brown. And then the last name I've got is Kenneth Walker. I think it's a pretty good bounce back spot against the Rams after he got game scripted out of the Buffalo one last week. I think he'll come in medium owned.
if Travis Etienne misses, I think Tank Bigsby at 6,200 is in a really good spot. No one's going to want to play him because of the price and going up against an Eagles defense that has been pretty good. And that phone is driving me insane. Nick Chubb. I talked a little bit about it. I paused and I basically said, like, look, we're going to talk about it in the GPP section. At 5,800, at some point the talent just wins out. And, third week back, certainly a player who is right now is going to be less than 5% rostered. There's a chance that the Chargers see what Jameis Winston in this passing offense was able to do and aren't stacking the box nearly as much as Baltimore was last week. So Baltimore was basically like daring them to throw with one of the league's worst secondaries. So, Cleveland happily obliged and was able to have success. Devin Achan, I think, is in a really good spot, 6,700. We've already really talked about him quite a bit. And then Saquon Barkley is the last guy that I'll mention. So I think he's in a price point where a lot of people are going to be looking at Kyron Williams or Alvin Kamara. Alvin Kamara is right now going to be 35% rostered, which is insane. But I think Barkley, because of the vulture aspect of Jalen Hurts, is going to go underlook this week.
That
Please
was
mute
my
that
exact
phone.
He's talking to you, Phil.
That was mine. Sorry.
I think I was on the same place. I like that call out of Barkley, especially kind of the Jalen Hurts taking those 2 touchdowns last week and the fresh in people's minds. Just at the top of the board. I mean, you got Saquon Barkley going up against Jacksonville. We talked about Hurts going against Jacksonville, but Barkley very much in play against Jacksonville. Baltimore got beat last week against the Browns, and I imagine they're, every team is motivated every single week, but imagine the Ravens are a little bit extra motivated maybe this week after that loss, and Derrick Henry's sitting up there at the very, very top at 8,300. This could be a big Derrick Henry eats week against, I don't know if Bo Nix is really going to be able to push them, force them into the passing game, having to be a big part of that. I do like, Phil mentioned it in the cash game, Alexander Madison at 5,700, I think is in my GPP pool. I think that's about as low as you could possibly go. And you're exactly right on the usage. You hit all those points earlier. James Cook again went off against the Dolphins in week 2 and had that massive game there. Just looking for, I think the Bills defense or Bills offense is really starting to click, and this is a great matchup for them potentially. And then staying in that same game, Tua was back and Raheem Mostert got 2 touchdowns because that's what Raheem Mostert does when Tua Tagovailoa is playing quarterback and the Dolphins are able to score touchdowns. Maybe a pivot off of a lot of people playing on Achane. You can go with Mostert and having that goal line type role that he had before. Just, you never know how things are going to break there. So that would be my last play. But let's look at wide receivers here. And Devin, where are you looking at wide receivers?
Yeah, this one is interesting because I think you're looking at a build different than what we talked about in cash. So I'm looking at spending up. I like Jamar Chase at 8,600. CeeDee Lamb at 8,800 I think is interesting as well because you can certainly get there by playing, if I will say this, if Cedric Tillman is going to be really popular, he's not as of Wednesday. Right now he's about 10% rostered, and there's a big disparity between him and Elijah Moore. Maybe you look at Elijah Moore to pivot off of some of these other guys because they both have had a significant role over the last couple of weeks. I just like Tillman a little bit more in cash because I think he's safer. Looking down the board, I do think Calvin Ridley, it was previously mentioned, is in a really good spot. We saw him have a breakout game last week. Jalen Waddle at 5,500. We haven't seen the Dolphins really step up, but they certainly have that ability and that capability to do so. And then this is where I would target the Buffalo guys. I don't know that I agree that they're cash game plays per se. But Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir, I think, are better GPP plays than cash game plays this week.
Phil, do you have other plays?
Yes. So I already mentioned Puka Nakua for cash games. I don't think that he's going to be very owned overall. So as long as that ownership stays moderate, I think that he's also in play for tournaments. T. Higgins at 6,400 if he plays. He was out of practice again today, so that quad injury, he's looking iffy. But if he can give it a go, I like him for all the same reasons that Devin liked Chase and that we liked T. Higgins last week. The Buffalo receivers are definitely interesting. I also have them in my GPP pool here. I have Amari Cooper as my top play. I played him a good bit last week and it burned me, but I really want to be ahead of that first big game that he has with Josh Allen. I know that Buffalo is going to spread it around to those receivers a bit, but like, doesn't he have to at some point erase Mac Hollins completely from the game plan so that like we're no longer looking at that guy on the field and it's all Amari Cooper as an every down player?
Does he know the playbook?
Well, it's 3 weeks now, right? So I'm hoping that this is the week where it does happen, and if it is, then we're going to be ahead of the field on that because his ownership should be next to nothing this week. And how does next to nothing compare to the possibility that he does emerge as Josh Allen's top target? I would say it's slightly more than next to nothing. So I think that there is a little bit of an edge to be had to try to get ahead of a big Amari Cooper game. And I do like the matchup this week against the Dolphins. One other guy that hasn't been mentioned, and maybe this is just making the same point that Jeff already did about Chris Olave, only with a good player. Mason Tipton at 4,000 is probably not a good player, but we mentioned the spot against Carolina. Derek Carr is returning, I believe. We've got no Rashid Shaheed. We've got Bub Means out of practice, Cedric Wilson out of practice. So this is a similar scenario, or it could be a similar scenario to what I was talking about with Evan Ingram in Jacksonville. I mean, you might be looking at the targets just becoming conserved around Olave and Tipton. Tipton was an undrafted free agent. He did impress this summer enough to make the roster ahead of, man, I guess he's not that notable because I forgot his name already, but I drafted him a bunch in best ball. What was that guy's name? The big guy that was
Perry?
Yes, Perry. Thank you. Beat out Perry, landed that guy on waivers. And we've seen Derek Carr make good use of downfield weapons, right? He had a good rapport with Shaheed. This guy Tipton runs a 4.3, so he could get downfield and he's got good hands. They're playing against Carolina is the last pin that I'll put on that one. I think it's possible. Not a high exposure play, but I think someone that I'm going to be mixing in tournaments a bit is Mason Tipton.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Let's scrape the bottom of the barrel a little bit.
I already did. I just did it.
You did. Parker Washington at 3,600. I think that he could step in there, and especially depending on how decimated that wide receiver core could be. I mean, there could be they could need Parker Washington. He's might be the only player that's caught a pass on the wide receiver core active this week. Jalen Coker at 3,600 for the Carolina Panthers. Talk about that New Orleans game and that Carolina game that could just be just a mess. We saw Jalen Coker last week go 70 yards and a touchdown against the Broncos, and Broncos have traditionally been pretty strong against the pass. I mean, that was very much garbage time when he got the last one, but it wasn't garbage time for the Broncos because they were still running trick plays. And then maybe same game Xavier Legette at 5,300. It's a little bit more pricey. I probably would prefer just the complete punt on Coker at 36 if I'm touching that game. But that's all I've got for wide receivers. And do you have any punt tight ends that you're looking for, Phil, or any other plays on GPPs for tight ends?
No, not for tight ends. Just real quick on the Carolina wide receiver thing. I would be totally with you if it was Andy Dalton. Not sure how eager I am to do it with Bryce Young. I think most likely getting the call again this week, but we'll have to see how that plays out. In terms of tight ends, I had Kyle Pitts in my GPP section, which Devin had already covered. I mean, I think with all of the other plays out there, I think people might still be a little bit leery of trusting Pitts because he's been like the ultimate like fantasy football PTSD player over the last couple of seasons where people are just tired of it. But Devin made the points about how well he's playing, and we're seeing the Falcons finally using him on vertical routes more often, and he's winning downfield. Surprise, surprise. Just like everybody knew that he would. So they're finally doing it, and Dallas is just a laughing stock of a franchise again. They've given up 4 tight end touchdowns over the last 3 games. I think it's a great spot. But that was really it for tournaments for me.
Taysom Hill,
What do you got, Devin? Taysom.
3,800. I think his outlook improves with Derek Carr coming back. Certainly, if you're looking at a guy who's sub 4K, theoretically New Orleans should be able to score however they want against Carolina's defense. And Taysom Hill right now is 2% rostered, so it just an upside play. The price is too good, the matchup's too good. It's a play off of Kamara, who's going to be 30 to 40% rostered. If Hill gets 1 or 2 touchdowns, those are touchdowns Kamara wouldn't get.
You're forgetting that he has to. I was going to say you're forgetting he has to battle Mason Tipton for
stacking with Mason Tipton.
I trust Taysom Hill quite a bit more than Mason Tipton.
Oh my goodness.
This guy burns me every single time that I think about him. But if T. Higgins is out of the lineup, Mike Gesicki, I think, is in play at 3,100. We saw him go for 7 and 70 yards last week. So he had a big game in, I think it was week 2 when T. Higgins was out of the lineup. Interestingly enough, when T. Higgins was out of the lineup, it doesn't seem like Andre Yoshivas steps into any meaningful target share. They just spread the ball out. And like I said, it seemed like Mike Gesicki is the biggest beneficiary there. So just sitting there at the bottom of the barrel, that would be one. That's all I've got there. Let's move into our favorite stacks of the week. And Phil, what is your favorite stack of the week?
Yeah, I think I said it already. Play some Cleveland stacks. I think that they are just way too cheap, starting with Jameis Winston, going with any 2 of the receivers, adding in David Njoku. There's plenty of ways that you could play it. Worked out very well last week. And I think it'll work out again this week because they remain underpriced, and I think they'll remain, for the most part, underowned. Maybe not Cedric Tillman, but I think the other guys aren't going to get too much action. And then the other one that I like, I mentioned Rudolph and Ridley, and I think a good run back for that type of stack, if you think that the game is actually going to get some points going, I think that that's either going to come. I think it's very much more likely to come through the running game for the Patriots, and that is Ramondre Stevenson, who was back to a pretty substantial workload against the Jets last week. So, if you play it that he has multiple touchdowns, Rudolph and Ridley go off again, nobody is really going to go there in tournaments, I don't think.
I'm going to go with an under the radar stack. And I don't know that it's my favorite, but certainly it's one that I'm going to be targeting this week. And that's Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and Kyle Pitts. I think this is a week where we saw at the end of last week where Lamb had just a monster second half in garbage time, but they sort of just need to get every play, just throw to CeeDee Lamb like they did the second half of last year. And I think this could be a week where they just target him early and often.
Dolphins-Bills is a rivalry game in my household. My daughter, 9-year-old girl. The Dolphins are the favorite team of 9-year-old girls because they're aqua and orange and all that. And my daughter really sticks it to me when the Bills play the Dolphins, but I usually push it back because the Bills usually beat the Dolphins. But Josh Allen, Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, just stack it up. Just go with it. Rivalry game in the Bell household. Dad's going to win again. So we'll go with that. Favorite discount play of the week. Phil, what's your favorite discount play of the week?
I'm just trying to search for one besides the obvious Mason Tipton. Not really coming up with much, so I guess that's where I'm landing. Play Mason Tipton and pray.
What do you got, Devin?
I'm going to go, Jeff. The best discount play that you can do this week is going to your local polls and voting. It's free. What's better than free? Get out there and vote. I don't care who you vote for. Just vote.
They even give you a sticker.
You get a free sticker. My daughter thought it was the absolute coolest thing in the world. No, Gardner Minshew, Cedric Tillman, those are my guys.
Yeah, I think Mike Gesicki is going to be my discount play of the week. 3,100. I'm going to jinx the heck out of him because he will do nothing this week. So that's how it always works with me and Mike Gesicki. That's our relationship. But that's all we got for you tonight for week 9. Devin, why don't you send the people home with some wisdom?
Week 9, we're halfway through the season after this week, so enjoy it. Hopefully it goes better than what my cracking FanDuel lineup has done the last 2 weeks. Still 5-3 on the season, but we got to start winning on that, but we'll see.